The Dutch East India Company, or the V.O.C, dominated the 17th century spice trade. It financed expeditions across oceans, mapping coastlines Europeans had never seen. It helped turn Amsterdam into the financial capital of the world. It pioneered joint stock ownership and modern accounting, and had a large part to play in the creation of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, considered the oldest in the world. If you go to Amsterdam, Rotterdam or Utrecht today, a large share of the buildings, art and infrastructure that you see was funded either directly or indirectly by V.O.C profits. For Europeans, the V.O.C was venturing into a new frontier, and it benefited from being amongst the first to arrive. Similarly, today, some companies are trying to capitalise on a new frontier, the final frontier. I'm sure you've heard of SpaceX, and maybe also Blue Origin, which are owned by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. These companies are trying to make a profit in space by providing internet service with satellite networks, through space tourism, and by developing the engines and infrastructure that governments and other companies will rely on. But the potential benefits of this new market go far beyond tourism or satellite internet. Even relatively close to Earth, there are resources that could, in theory, make certain goods much cheaper and easier to produce. Take helium-3 for example. It's used in specialised low-temperature physics, and it's also one of the fuels proposed for future fusion reactors, but it's extremely scarce on Earth. However, large amounts have built up on the lunar soil, meaning the moon could provide an abundant source of this expensive element. And helium-3 is just one example. Certain near-Earth asteroids contain unusually high concentrations of metals like nickel and platinum, which are expensive to mine here, but occur in a much purer form in space. The V.O.C, SpaceX and Blue Origin all share a few things in common. Both the V.O.C and the companies involved in the new space race face enormous risk in relation to both the risk to life and the risk to returns. Between 1602 and 1795, about 1 million seamen and craftsmen departed from Holland, but only 340,000 returned. J.L. van Zanden writes that the V.O.C consumed approximately 4,000 people per year. Human spaceflight is still risky too. Launch failures are now relatively rare, but when they happen, they are catastrophic, and long-duration space missions expose astronauts to radiation, muscle loss, and other health problems that no technology has solved yet. For investors in the V.O.C, a single lost ship could wipe out the returns from an entire voyage, and this happened often. In the company's first decade, almost 1 in 5 ships never made it back to Europe. The financial risks are just as severe for modern space firms. Rocket development costs billions, returns take years to materialise, and most revenue still depends on government contracts that shift with political priorities. The success of any given voyage requires loading valuable cargo onto an expensive rocket, filling it with expensive fuel, and igniting it in what is essentially a controlled explosion. A single failure can wipe out a launch vehicle, a payload, months of revenue, and if it's a crewed mission, can cost the lives of anyone on board. To better understand the issues raised by commercial spaceflight and exploration, I spoke to Professor Ron Davies of University College Dublin, the author of the following article, which is linked below, and who specialises in international trade, foreign investment, and tax competition.
There are lots of benefits to the new space race, and it really depends on how far down the line do you want to look. If you want to look really far down the line, if we hope to maintain ourselves as a species, we got to get off this rock. The sun will eventually explode and Earth is going to be gone. Now that presumably is quite a ways away, but more immediately, we've already benefited a lot from the space race. The way our information and communications network exists would not be there if we didn't have satellites. And a lot of those satellites are privately owned. We are starting to see the development of pharmaceuticals in low-gravity situations where I'm not a chemist, but you can apparently do things in that sort of environment that you can't do on Earth. Down the line and looking towards the ability to harvest minerals or other materials from Mars, from meteors or asteroids, all of those are things that probably will be quite useful for us. So, it is a new set of resources that we don't currently have available to us that we can exploit. I think there are tremendous benefits as a result.
Unfortunately, there are a few issues in the way that space exploration currently operates. Could you give a sort of elevator pitch or a brief overview of the situation as you see it?
So, what sets apart the current space race from the first one is the level of private sector involvement. And why that matters to me is the way in which space is currently regulated, it's kind of not. What happens off-world is there is a framework, but it's really poorly defined, and liability rests with states rather than agents. And so if Elon Musk does something in space that damages somebody else, it's not clear to what degree and how you would actually be able to hold him in any sense liable for it.
A major issue that Europeans faced when trying to buy spices in Asia was that Europeans had few goods that Asian consumers actually wanted, other than silver and gold. One of the reasons the V.O.C. was so successful was because it came up with a clever way to overcome this issue. It needed to create an intra-Asiatic trade system. In other words, a system where they traded goods within Asia by taking silver and copper from Japan and trading it for things like silk, cotton, porcelain and textiles from India and China. These were then either sent back to the Netherlands or traded for spices. SpaceX encountered its own problems when it tried to enter the commercial space industry. Getting to space was prohibitively expensive. As I mentioned earlier, expensive rockets were built and filled with a lot of expensive fuel, and they were sent into space. Hopefully the cargo would reach its target, but neither the rocket nor the fuel would return to Earth. I don't think I have to explain why the fuel doesn't make it back to Earth, but as for the rocket, the upper stage burned up on re-entry, and the first stage, which is the most expensive stage, fell into the ocean and was lost. SpaceX realised how wasteful this was, and began designing rockets that could be recovered, refurbished and reused. In 2006, the company began working on its Falcon rocket series. Between 2006 and 2008, the company's first 3 Falcon 1 launches failed, each destroying the rocket and its payload. The company had enough money for one final attempt that would either make or break the company. This last roll of the dice culminated in the first successful launch of the Falcon 1 rocket on the 28th of September 2008. The following month, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract for cargo deliveries to the International Space Station. That deal effectively saved the company and allowed it to continue developing the reusable systems that would eventually make Falcon 9 the workhorse of the commercial space industry. Blue Origin took a different approach to the same problem. Instead of relying on commercial contracts to survive each development phase, the company is funded almost entirely by Jeff Bezos himself, who sells roughly $1 billion worth of Amazon stock each year to keep the company running. This means Blue Origin doesn't face the same short-term financial pressures that nearly sank SpaceX in its early years. It can pursue multi-year research projects, absorb delays, and operate without the immediate need for profitable launches. However, in the absence of external investors, this means the company is accountable to only one person. This raises questions about who will actually benefit from the wealth created by the new space race.
So, in terms of the wealth that gets generated from space, what I expect will happen is exactly what we've seen happen already, which is that there's tremendous value being created and it's increasingly concentrated in not the top 1%, but the top 0.1%, 0.01%. And I don't see anything in the way that we're approaching space resources and the exploitation of space that will change that. You know, currently it would purely be whatever earthbound laws and efforts to redistribute wealth would apply. As things progress to the point where there are companies that only exist in space, there is no ability currently to tax such activity and bring it back. So, you know, given that space is already concentrated in such a small number of hands, and let's be honest, very wealthy hands, the idea that these guys are suddenly going to start sharing the gains, I think is perhaps more far-fetched than some of what we're going to talk about in terms of what's going to happen in space.
On the one hand, I could see an argument that it doesn't really matter if one person's percentage of the pie increases if the overall size of the pie increases too. So in other words, space exploration may increase the percentage of wealth held by Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, but we all benefit from cheaper goods, better services, for instance satellite internet, and maybe even increased employment. But then, on the other hand, I can see an argument that this massive wealth held by just a few individuals would create sort of negative spillovers, such as political lobbying for things like weaker worker protections. What would be your thoughts on this?
I'm going to sound like an economist. Concentrating wealth has both positive and negative effects. Let's start with the good. If I can get super rich by putting in extra effort, well, then I have an incentive to put in extra effort. And that is the typical reason to allow a capitalist kind of economy, is it gives people the incentive to go the extra mile. But if you're relying on those things to trickle down, it's not that they don't have wider impacts in terms of prices, the availability of goods, but it's pretty clear that the benefits to others are not as large as the benefits to the individual in any sense. And somewhere in between, 100% for the individual and 100% for everybody else, there's a line. And where we are in that line, there's no clear answer. It's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on one's own belief about how these things play out. It's a value judgment. But I do think that in the current society, we've allowed things to get far too close to all being in the hands of the individual. And that is creating frustration for a lot of people. It's creating perceptions of unfairness. And when people begin to view the structure of society as unfair, I think that makes it very hard to maintain that society. What I'm concerned about with regards to space is because it is so much a handful of countries. We're talking the US, China, and Russia, basically. Even Europe is lagging behind in the space race. And, we're at a situation where, as of today, it's not clear how friendly the US and Europe are. And if space starts to become exploited and only benefits certain countries, there's going to be viewed an inherent unfairness in the global system, not just a national system.
Something we haven't discussed yet is the role of subsidies. So what role have subsidies played in the new space race so far, and why might governments see strategic value in supporting these private firms?
Subsidies in the space race are probably necessary. And so before we talk about space itself, let's talk about why we use subsidies at all. And the idea is that, if you come up with this idea and it creates 1,000 in benefits, some of that may not go to you as an individual. Maybe you're going to get 800 out of the 1,000. Well, if it's going to cost 900 for you to do it, you're going to say, well, it's not worth it. I'd lose $100 on the deal. But for society, it's worth it. And so the government might want to step in and provide you with the extra 100 to make it worth your while, because that increases the overall surplus to society as a whole. Now with space, these are brand new technologies. Some of them have been around for, let's say 70 years. That's still pretty brand new in the course of human history. And they're expensive because, what we're doing is difficult. It's very challenging. It's very risky. There's a lot of risk to it and there's great cost. And so there needs to be equally great benefit for people to undertake a fully privately funded effort to develop the technology. But still, we believe that there are great benefits to society as a whole, individual countries or the planet.
A lack of demand wasn't the only issue facing European traders in Asia. In the 16th and very early 17th centuries, the norm was for companies to be founded and funded for the duration of a single voyage, and then the company would be liquidated upon the return of the fleet. This meant that investing in one of these companies was incredibly risky. Not only did these fleets encounter all of the risks that you might expect, such as piracy, disease, and shipwrecks, but the goods they were trading had inelastic demand, but volatile supply, meaning even a small disruption could cause enormous swings in price. It was actually the English who first solved this problem by creating the English East India Company in the year 1600 to control the supply of these goods. By 1602, the Dutch had replicated this with its own East India Company, whose charter granted it exclusive rights to all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. For a time, the company had managed to monopolise the trade in nutmeg, mace and cloves, selling them in Europe at prices that could reach hundreds of times what it had paid for those spices in Indonesia. They achieved this by controlling the relevant trade routes and ports, and eventually the production of the spices themselves. In the islands where nutmeg and cloves were grown, local chiefs and sultans were forced into exclusive contracts, and when production rose too high, the company simply burned the excess. Once the spices left the islands, the company hoarded them in warehouses in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and Amsterdam, releasing shipments slowly to keep prices high and profits steady. The profits were enormous, and the same Amsterdam merchants who held shares in the company also sat in city councils and provincial assemblies, meaning they could shape policies that protected their own investments. Monopolies are not always state-sanctioned. Sometimes, companies create a monopoly through market dominance by being a first mover, shaping regulation in their favour, and scaling up so quickly that competitors can no longer afford to catch up. In many ways, that's what the companies leading the new space race are trying to do. They've launched thousands of satellites into orbit, claiming the most valuable frequencies and orbital paths before anyone else had the chance to compete. Each new launch lowers their costs further, widening the gap between them and any firm still trying to enter the market. Government contracts then reinforce that lead, providing a steady revenue and political backing that make outside competition even less likely.
How do we want to think about competition in the launching industry? It's useful to provide a monopoly rights at the start of something because, again, there's big risks and there's big costs, so there needs to be big rewards. And you can provide subsidies to lower those costs, or you can provide bigger benefits, such as we're going to get rid of competition so you can charge higher prices. That's going to increase the benefit. That's what happened back in the early multinationals. It happens in a lot of situations. You could lower taxes. So you could say, okay, we want you to innovate, and what we want out of that innovation is, this product or this process will now exist. And what we're going to do is we're just not going to charge you a tax on the revenues generated from that in order to spur that kind of innovation. So lots of governments are now starting to do that through patent boxes or knowledge boxes or whatever you want to call it. We'll just cut the corporate tax rate. So, there are lots of reasons to provide monopolies up front. But then eventually I do think the pendulum starts to swing towards more competition will bring prices down, spreading some of the benefits to more consumers. More competition will spur certain kinds of innovation that has societal benefits. So like anything else, it's you need to find that balancing point somewhere in between monopoly, really competitive market to get the best of both worlds. And that will shift over time.
On government reliance, do you see any issues arising there where, for instance, the US government might become reliant on Starlink for maybe military purposes? Do you think that that might give almost a dangerous amount of leverage to the likes of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos?
So becoming reliant on someone has lots of good properties. They know me and I know them. I know what I'm getting out of this relationship. But it also can tie you into something that maybe you don't want to be tied to. So, for example, with Ukraine, Starlink was a really big part of the communications and still is there. But if Elon Musk decides to stop providing service, which he can do, suddenly the government there is in really deep water. And so if you rely on an individual to provide you something, it's efficient, but it does tie you to them, and that relationship can be very hard to break, especially in the short run. And so, if we're relying on SpaceX or we're relying on Virgin Galactic to provide our launch technologies, what do we do if we don't want to use them, or they decide we're not going to carry a certain kind of cargo? Then you've got to find a competitor that may or may not exist. And so there are significant dangers in tying yourself to a single company or to a single individual. And that needs to be thought about in terms of promoting competition, deciding who's going to get what government contracts, all of these different things.
Although the V.O.C. was granted a monopoly on trade in its charter, the English, Portuguese and other powers weren't just going to accept this, and the Dutch knew that. Therefore, the V.O.C. charter also granted the company a tremendous amount of autonomy and allowed it to build forts, maintain armies and conclude treaties with Asian rulers. It handled its own foreign policy within reason and conducted many wars of conquest. Over the first half of the 17th century, the V.O.C. seized or built a chain of fortified ports across Asia to secure its trade routes. In 1605, it captured Ambon from the Portuguese, giving the company its first permanent base in the East Indies. In 1619, it took Jakarta, renamed it Batavia, and turned it into the administrative and military centre of its Asian operations. 2 decades later, in 1641, it captured Malacca, securing control of the main passage between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This meant that they could block rival ships, enforce exclusive contracts, and move goods through ports it controlled, from Sri Lanka to Taiwan to Japan. So how does all of this relate to the new space race? From this point on, when discussing the new space race, we'll be entering the realm of speculation. But that's not to say that what we are discussing is unrealistic. In 1967, the major spacefaring nations signed the Outer Space Treaty. It bans weapons of mass destruction in orbit and prevents countries from claiming the moon or any other celestial body as sovereign territory. But the treaty was written for states, not companies, and it places the responsibility for private actors on their home governments. That means a company can do almost anything in space, unless its own government actively stops it. The treaty also says nothing about how firms may defend their satellites, secure lunar facilities, or enforce access to infrastructure they build. There is no enforcement mechanism, no clear rules on who owns what in space, and nothing that explains whether companies can keep others away from the areas they operate in. This means there's no legal framework that would stop a private company from creating its own security force in space if it decided it needed one. So we're venturing into hypotheticals here, and viewers may think that this is all a bit far-fetched, but what might you say to those who believe that?
It sounds goofy, and it sounds like, this is stuff that will never happen. But the one real agreement we have to deal with outer space is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And one of the very explicit things it says, and the very few explicit things it rules out, is the militarization of space. It quite specifically rules out nuclear weapons in space. In general, space is to be used for the benefit of all mankind. Now, if they're talking about that in 1967, to say that these things are completely far-fetched, I don't think is as forward-thinking as it needs to be. Just in the past couple of years, Russia threatened to start putting nukes in space, which would have violated the Outer Space Treaty. Governments are clearly talking about these things. If there's resources to be had in space, there's going to be somebody that wants to take those resources away from you. Whether the militarization is done by governments, which is not allowed under the Space Treaty, or whether it's done by private firms in terms of private security, to me those are kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other. The militarization of space will happen. We're not supposed to invade other countries. That doesn't seem to necessarily be binding in all situations. And so the same problems will arise in space. Human nature is human nature.
On Earth, we've seen countries use militias or private military companies such as Wagner or Blackwater in America to engage in military operations with so-called plausible deniability. Do you think that this is something we might see in space?
Will it happen in space? Of course. Why wouldn't it? The money is there. Why do these groups exist on Earth? Because there's enough money to pay them and something left over for me to still find this valuable to do as a company, to hire these guys. There are people willing to do it, and there's a perceived need or desire if they're doing something to perhaps unfairly coerce decision makers. Why would any of this be different in space? Humans are humans. Yeah, even in zero gravity, we're still going to be greedy. So these things, I think, will emerge, and they probably will emerge to a large degree with government support. And I say that because, one, again, the lack of militarization of space is one reason why governments might prefer this to be done by private companies. Putting boots on ground is, for militaries on Earth, is a big deal. Putting boots on the moon would be an even bigger deal. And so, pushing off some of that liability, some of that perception of who's doing it to these companies that are kind of out of the public eye, I think is going to be the same incentives will apply in space as they do on Earth.
So then, given how sparse the legal framework is, how realistic is it that private firms could end up controlling key infrastructure, is what I call it, in space, in the same way that the V.O.C. controlled trade routes? Maybe infrastructure is too strict of a term, things like orbital paths. How likely is it that private firms may end up dominating and controlling these infrastructure, as I call them?
So, according to the Outer Space Treaty, you cannot claim space as your own private property. You cannot lay claim to a celestial body. But these terms legally are a bit loose. And, for example, if you go and you dig something up and move it, that you can own. And so where is that line between a celestial body and something that is now yours? That is very loosely defined and has yet to really be tested in any court of law. Currently, the U.S. is trying to push through what's called the Artemis Accords, which is a new set of agreements that not only allows for space exploration and more privatization of space, but it would allow for, if I've got a facility, I can declare a safety zone around it that you're not supposed to come into. So, in terms of as these things begin, this issue of private security forces, I think, is going to be a legitimate one. If we want to think not just about like a territory, I'm drilling here, but I'm using a particular route. So I'm using the lowest energy trajectory from point A to point B. If somebody else is already in that route, what do I do? Do I have to go around them? Do they need to make room for me? What if they put something that sits there and essentially blockades it? They could say, oh, well, I'm doing some sort of scientific experiment and you can't come within 20,000 kilometers of this because that's my safety zone or more. It becomes very challenging to sort of say, no, these things won't happen because there's going to be an incentive to. And I'm going to have an incentive to put my scientific experiment right where your ships want to travel. Then we start thinking about, okay, if we want to get stuff off the planet, the closer you are to the equator, the easier it is because of the way the Earth spins. As payloads get lighter and lighter, we can move further north, but there is a geographic benefit to certain locations in terms of launch technology. What if I decide, oh, this country near the equator that's great for launching, they're not letting me use that facility. I have to have that for national security. In terms of re-entry, certain countries might be islands, so there's lots of water around them, which is great for re-entry. So, the fact that property rights aren't very well defined, to the extent that they are, it's essentially no one has the right to keep anybody else out. But that's inconsistent with, we want companies to undertake all of these costs and risks to generate these benefits. These things simply don't add up.
You're working on a paper that models two countries competing for control over future space resources. If we follow the incentives that you outline in this paper, what does your model predict about how these countries will behave, and what's the expected outcome from this behaviour?
If we take as given that the economics of space work largely as they do on Earth, in other words, companies want to maximize profits, governments are out to maximize what is best for their country as a whole, taking into account their companies and their citizens. And then we would still like to think about, maybe we want to think about what's good for the planet or all of humanity as a whole. Those are different levels of thinking about things. And so with the lack of enforcement in space, with poorly defined property rights, and with very poorly defined liability, I do expect us to see the rise of private security in space. This may be company owned, like we saw with the first multinationals. It may be subcontracted to mercenary groups, but this will arise. But still, the technologies to have a drone in space that can protect my mining site or protect my shipping route. Those technologies are going to be very similar to the technologies that get used for how do we just get a rocket into space? How do we develop a satellite that can operate autonomously without necessarily a nefarious purpose, but something that could go around and fix other satellites or clean up space junk or whatever? Those technologies are going to be very similar. The cleaning up space junk technology is one that has a lot of public benefit. So we want to subsidize that. We really would love something like that. But as we subsidize that, we're implicitly subsidizing the dual use technology for things that might have destructive capabilities. But as I sort of think about this as a government, well, if I can subsidize kind of both of these at the same time, and I can then push the capabilities of my guys to get there first and claim this space and say this is our safety zone around it. If I can subsidize the ability of my guys to develop a faster ship or something that works just a little bit better, that gives them that competitive edge in the industry, I have an incentive to do that because they're my companies, they're my guys. I like that. And so governments have an incentive to subsidize their firms to give them that edge, that first mover advantage, some of which is also going to be in non-productive military aspects. And every government has that same incentive. And so there's an incentive for governments to push the level of subsidies in order to get there first and protect it once you've gotten there first. And some of that is going to be relatively wasteful. And so where I think all of this is going to lead is we're currently in a situation where it's really the US and China. Russia does spend a lot in terms of space technology compared to others, but it's pretty far behind. And given the situation with Russia right now, I just see them falling further and further behind. Europe is catching up, but it's got a lot of ways to go before it gets anywhere close to the US. So if the US and China are investing so much money in these technologies that, yes, have beneficial productive purposes, but also have purposes of maintaining control, they're going to invest perhaps more than what the planet as a whole would like because they're trying to keep it for themselves. But also the first mover advantages they create are going to persist over time. Europe is not only already starting behind, but the gap is growing. Africa has not started. Latin America has not started. Southeast Asia has not started. They're going to lag even further behind. And so the inequalities that we've already got on Earth, the US is way ahead of everybody else, is just going to get even worse. In particular, if they're thinking strategically, by investing now and creating present might in space ability is going to create future right. If we can call the shots because we're there and we're already there and we're fighting from the top of the hill down, that's going to give them the edge when it comes time to say, how do we want to define property rights? How do we want to define liability? How do we want to say, this is mine and that is yours?
Across the territories it controlled, the V.O.C. relied heavily on unfree labour. In Batavia, the company's Asian headquarters, enslaved people made up more than half of the population by the mid-17th century, and thousands were imported each year from the Coromandel Coast, Bali, Sulawesi, and East Africa. These workers were forced into plantation work, domestic service, construction, and military labour. The company also used convicts and war captives as a coerced workforce for shipyards, fortifications, and other state-run projects. Another system that developed alongside outright slavery was debt bondage. The V.O.C. recruited workers from India, China, and Southeast Asia on agreements that, on paper, promised wages and a fixed term of service. In practice, many of these workers began their contracts already in debt because the company fronted the travel costs and treated them as debts the workers were required to repay. Wages were routinely withheld, contracts were extended to cover these costs, and leaving a job without permission was treated as a criminal offence. It created a workforce that was technically waged, but had almost no freedoms. Labour in space could likely face very similar problems. Anyone working on the moon, an asteroid, or a private space station would be physically isolated and completely dependent on their employer for air, water, shelter, and transport home. Presumably, walking away from a job becomes more complicated when home is nearly 400,000 kilometres away. As for the legality of poor working conditions, companies that are based in countries with loose labour laws here on Earth might not have to hide anything. But even those based in countries with strict labour laws would likely be able to hide any questionable working conditions. Regulators might not be able to make a surprise inspection of a private base hundreds of thousands of kilometres away. If you think all of this is a bit far-fetched, we don't have to look to futuristic space settlements or early 17th century colonies to see these predatory labour practices. Labour systems like this exist today in places like Qatar, where migrant workers sign long contracts, take on debts to secure these jobs, and then find that leaving is far harder than it looked on paper.
I think to compare space employment to something like Qatar isn't a very good analogy, because it's true that in Qatar there are a lot of people that come from places like India thinking, I'm going to get these great wages, it's going to be awesome. They get there and it hasn't proven to be like what they thought it would be like. They were either completely uninformed or just simply lied to. For space, I don't think that's likely. Certainly not anytime soon. And the reason why is that not many people can do it. We've all seen movies where you get put in the thing and they spin you around to make sure you can deal with the forces of just getting put into space. Not everybody can handle that kind of thing. Not everybody can handle what it feels like to be in low gravity situations. And so, out of everybody, some people are going to be physically able. Some of those people are actually going to have the skills to do what you need, because if you've got somebody operating at such a distance, you're going to need their ability to make wise decisions on the fly without a lot of backup from the headquarters. And so you're talking about even within the group that's physically capable, those that have the skill set. Then you've got those that are willing to be gone. It's not like you're gonna go away for a week, working in an office in the next country over and fly back home. Especially when we're talking about things like the moon or Mars, you're going to be gone a long time. And so for workers in those sorts of situations, how many people are going to be willing to do that? If you're sending someone to build satellites in space, they're not going to be a grunt. They're going to be an engineer, someone probably with a PhD. I know lots of people with PhDs who aren't very street smart, but they know to read the contract. And so I don't think that the degree of being uninformed about what it's like is there. I think that, in addition, that because an employer understands I need these type of people, they're going to really need to be able to compete to entice them to go. Because again, it is still dangerous to go to space.
Across the territories it controlled, the V.O.C. pushed the cost of its operations onto the people who lived there. Forests were cleared to make way for plantations, farmland was destroyed during military campaigns, and local economies were reshaped around a narrow set of export crops that served the company's interests, rather than those of the local communities. The cost of the resulting violence, famine, and displacement fell largely on the people who were never participants in the trade itself. The term economists use for these costs is negative externalities. Negative externalities are costs imposed on people who are not part of the buying or selling that created them. When a company profits from a trade, but the environmental damage or social disruption falls on people who had no role in that exchange, those harms remain outside the market and never appear in the price of the goods being sold. For example, if I smoke a cigarette and you inhale the secondhand smoke, that is a negative externality for you. I got the cigarette company got my money, and all you got was a cost to your health. We may see a similar pattern in the new space race. The companies launching satellites or planning missions to the moon and asteroids will earn the profits, but the wider consequences such as orbital debris, spectrum congestion, or contamination of potential research sites fall on everyone else who uses space or depends on satellites here on Earth. These are costs that no individual firm has an incentive to address, but which could make space more dangerous, more crowded, and more expensive for all future users. One of the risks often discussed is Kessler syndrome. If two satellites collide, the fragments can hit others, creating a chain reaction that could render entire orbital paths unusable. In low Earth orbit, a screw or a piece of shrapnel that travels between 7 to 10 kilometers per second could punch holes in spacecraft or destroy a satellite outright. There are also concerns about biological or chemical contamination of lunar or asteroid surfaces, which could erase scientific evidence before researchers have the chance to study it.
In space, the tragedy of the commons really comes to the forefront. No one can ring off this bit of space and say, this is mine. And so one of the aspects of that is we've got a lot of space debris. And so, this affects obviously things in space, but it also affects things on Earth. So let's talk about what it does for Earth at the moment. Certain countries, such as Chile, for them actually a reasonably big industry is Earth-based observation. So they've got these big telescopes up in the Andes and they look out. But we've got all this stuff floating around and it's really getting in the way. And so this is a concern for them that if earthbound observatories become useless, that's a problem for their economy. Now, in terms of space, we've all heard about, space debris. So many movies have, I got hit by this tiny little thing. Now suddenly my satellite's exploding. The thing is, it happens. We see this actually happening. And again, it's tempting to say, okay, my satellite got hit by your junk. You owe me money. First off, there's the liability. My satellite got hit by your junk. I would have to ask my government to go after your government, who would have to go after you. The second thing is, though, how do we determine whose junk it was? Because we've got this space registry, which is supposed to keep track of everything that's out there, but it clearly doesn't. If we're talking about flecks of paint that move so fast they can shatter hard substances, you don't know whose fleck of paint it was. And so this is a real concern. And as we get more and more junk in space, as it becomes more and more congested, the probability of these collisions is simply going to go up. So the ability to go after somebody who caused you damages realistically just isn't there in most situations. So how do we then deal with this? Well, a lot of governments have, whenever you launch something and you register your object with your National Space Agency, which then feeds it into the UN, you're supposed to have an end-of-life plan. So when this object is finished, what do I do with it? And basically you have one of two options. You can either bring it back in and burn it up on re-entry, or you can move it beyond low Earth orbit, move it far enough out so it's not in anybody's way again. So let's talk about the second one first. If you don't leave enough fuel in the tank to get all the way to where you're supposed to be, you haven't lived up to your agreement. There has now been one company that got sued by the US government. They were fined for not taking their object far enough away after the end of life plan. Now let's talk about the other way around. What happens when we just crash it into the atmosphere and it burns up? That creates pollution. That pollution affects everybody. What happens if the object has nuclear materials on it and that spreads? This is one of the big worries about launching nuclear reactors into space. There's a good chance it's going to blow up in the atmosphere. That's not a good thing. So how do we then assign where the damage has occurred from these things? We can't even figure that with Earth-based carbon emissions. We can't even deal with the emissions we create on planet. The idea that we're going to be able to do this, especially when it's like spread across half the globe as it re-enters, we're not going to fix those issues.
The final frontier holds immense potential to create wealth and improve life here on Earth. However, a lack of regulation and vague international treaties raise questions about who will benefit from this wealth, and may incentivize monopolistic behaviour and conflict, while creating massive negative externalities for the majority of the population. But if we learn from the history of the V.O.C. and colonisation in general, there's the possibility of reaping the benefits of this new frontier while avoiding some of the mistakes of the past. If we want to maximise the welfare gains from space exploration, it's essential that we begin strengthening treaties and creating incentive structures that foster friendly competition in space.
As an economist, we are the dismal science. We're sort of trained to be pessimists. And it's easy to be pessimistic about space. And it's easy to be optimistic about space. And the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle. But I do think we have the opportunity to really think about these issues before it goes that far. We're going to make mistakes. We always do as a species. I'd like to see us get more right than perhaps we have with some of our past approaches to new industries. I think we can. I think, there's certainly scope to.
Ron, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's a fantastic chat. Is there anything that you want to sort of plug like an article or a social media or anything?
So I, as well as Rodrigo Polanco and Joe Francois, Franco's, we have a book coming out on the law and economics of outer space, based off of a conference that we did in Switzerland a couple of years ago. So it will be out in Heart Publications, I believe, this autumn.
I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you might also enjoy this video about what really ended the transatlantic slave trade, or this video about why Ireland still doesn't have nuclear energy. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time on Econ Unpacked.